Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today. This is our first event in our Microsoft Masterclass series. So we'll be hosting a series of events over the coming weeks and months, basically helping you guys get the most out of Microsoft 365. Our first one today is a whistle-stop tour about planning a Microsoft 365 strategy. So kind of the agenda that we'd like to cover off are around the governance, adoption, security, migration, and at the very end, there'll be time for questions and answers. So if you guys have any questions for me as we go through this process, just let me know and we'll answer those at the end for you. The event will be recorded and we'll put it on YouTube, so you can play this back if you're not able to stay for the full webinar. And you can also forward that on to your co-workers if you feel that would be of interest. I've also put into the Q&A a link to our next event, which will be hosted in January, which is adopting Microsoft 365. So some of the topics today will touch lightly upon adoption, but in the next event, we'll go into that in a lot more detail and share with you some of the tips and tricks that you can use for adopting this platform. I'm Hugh Valentine, Managing Director here at Valto, and really specialise in helping organisations get the most out of their Microsoft 365 investment, and also just digital transformation as a whole and how we can use the Microsoft stack to achieve that. The takeaways for today would be defining a Microsoft 365 roadmap, understanding the governance and the security, talking through adoption, change management and training, and also some of the best practices around migration and the things that you need to think about. So we often kind of, to understand how you can build a Microsoft 365 strategy, what you often need to do is start off with understanding the Microsoft 365 products that are available. So I'm just going to quickly share with you an example of what we usually go through with some of our clients, which is a Microsoft 365 strategy workshop. Now, this is a paid for exercise. We often sit down with our clients, but what I hope to give you guys today is some of what we would go through that, so you guys can take that away and build your own strategy. But the idea of the workshop basically is to kind of outline what the objectives are for the Microsoft 365 platform. So as part of any goal for setting the roadmap, we need to understand what are the objectives. What would you like this to look like at the end picture? It's very easy to miss this and not define those objectives. But if you want to replace bespoke applications that you might have, you might want to migrate your files, you might want to utilize Teams fully. It's really important that from the very beginning of our roadmap, we define those overall objectives and figure out what we want to do. With our roadmap, what we look to do for each of the product sets that we define in our objectives, we like to try and define some timescales. What are any prerequisites to deployment? So, for example, you may not want to go ahead with rolling out files for Teams until the actual Teams application has been deployed. So we need to understand those prerequisites. Any other considerations around that? So what would be the impact on user training? Does it require the culture to change? What are the disaster recovery implications? So if we do make these changes, do we need to think about, is that going to affect our backup process? So Office 365 isn't generally backed up. So if we move everything over into 365, we need to make sure we're aware of what the disaster recovery implications are. Is it being backed up? And therefore, if it's not being backed up currently, we need to put something in place. And also, if there's an outage with 365, what is your fallback plan, if any? What would you do in the case of an outage? Quite often these things are missed during the initial planning. Of course, we cover off costings to deploy those applications, and we look to deploy a roadmap. So kind of one of the key objectives of Microsoft 365 and developing the roadmap is understanding what tools and capabilities are available. Now, we won't go through these today, but we've done lots of sessions and we'll be hosting more sessions on the Microsoft 365 toolsets. And we generally try to break these down into two classes. We have productivity tools and security tools. Now, the productivity tools are effectively about all of the licensing all of the tools that we have available to us as part of office.com. So these are the ones that generally are the users will be using on a day-to-day basis, and they're there and designed to improve productivity in the organization. So we have the simple ones like Exchange for hosting your emails. We have SharePoint, which can be used as a full place to basically provide an intranet document management. It can provide applications. OneDrive, which can be used for storing your personal documentation, and then we have Microsoft Teams and Power Platform. Now, in our previous sessions, which we've hosted and they're available on YouTube, I would advise that you go ahead and look at those applications or get in touch with myself if you need a deep dive into what the capabilities of these product sets are. It will be very difficult for you guys to define this roadmap without knowing what each of the product sets do, how other organizations are deploying them, and the common pitfalls and points of egress that those applications have. So that's often the starting point. Understand the productivity tools, understand what's available, and then we can tie that back into the strategy and the plan as we go through. The next piece we have then is the actual security tools. We often talk when we are rolling out Microsoft 365 environments about having a baseline of security. So what security needs to be in place as we activate each of these services. So often for most 365 environments and clients, we would have a minimum set of security tools that are configured, such as conditional access, Intune, and advanced threat protection. And this gives us the layer that allows us then to enable and activate these tools. Knowing we've considered the security and activated the relevant features will then enable us to make sure that as we adopt and start to activate these services, that the security is there and basically facilitating that. So the very first piece that we would recommend around this is just understanding the Microsoft 365 product sets that are available to you. Once you understand what you can do from a productivity and a security benefit, then it will become much easier to help you plan that roadmap as we go through. The next piece is just around governance. So as we start to look at the tool sets that are available, it's important to make sure that as you activate services such as SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, Planner, you have to understand what is going to happen when we do that. For example, we have lots of organizations that have deployed Microsoft Teams and they've rolled this out across the user base, but they've not realized that by rolling out Teams with the default settings, everyone in a company can create a Microsoft team. And what that results in is what we call Microsoft Teams sprawl, where we have lots of organizations that have got thousands of teams. They're just people are creating teams without any structure. There's been no thought of the governance. And that implication then is it becomes very difficult to manage. I'm going to just quickly share with you an example of kind of what we might typically just show during a session like this. So I've got 3 infographics here, and we've got one here for SharePoint versus OneDrive versus Teams. So part of the governance piece is we need to know what do we intend to use each of these applications for. Now, we have a very clear way that we position these tool sets. We have SharePoint here, which we generally see as a company-wide tool. You wouldn't want to be going into SharePoint and hitting access denied messages. We'd look to basically create this as a publishing portal. The whole company would have access to it, and the sharing is open to all staff. So what that results in then is an intranet, which then has places for policies. It has perhaps departmental publishing sites where they can use that to share documents and templates and forms. As a very quick example of how that looks, if I go to our demo intranet site here, everyone has access to this initial landing page. But then when we jump into the team areas here, we've got areas such as finance and compliance and marketing. And what we wouldn't want to do is hit the compliance button and receive an access denied message, because that wouldn't be a good user experience. So with the kind of methodology I'm explaining here, if we use SharePoint as the open publishing portal, the compliance department would use this as a way of publishing all of the information that they want everyone in the company to see. And one of the benefits of that is it reduces emails that are sent. So if I can go to the compliance department, I can see frequently asked questions, I can see the key members of the team, and I can see the documents they're publishing. So perhaps that's now saved emails going back and forth to ask where do I find this information, or what do I do with this? So kind of one of the challenges we come across is, why should I update my departmental page? And if we flip that on the benefits of, well, you'll get less emails, it'll save you time in the long run, it becomes a clear-cut way forward for them to keep these pages up to date. We also then have, so SharePoint as the publishing portal. OneDrive is a very quick kind of place to put your personal documentation. And we also then have Microsoft Team areas. So we kind of publish Microsoft Teams areas as the collaboration area. So we could use those as places. I've got another infographic where we can see here how we commonly deploy teams in an organization. So we'd look at having departmental teams where we can basically replace their internal emails, provide a centralized communication place and meetings, and also migrate their files into the platform. We can also use them for projects and ad hoc. We could create a company-wide one, and we can also have a social and initiatives. So what I'm trying to do here really is give you a very quick insight into, when you're defining your strategy for 365, it's important that you know what are you going to use each of these tool sets for. Otherwise, it's going to be very confusing and you'll end up with pockets of data all over the place. And from a governance perspective, we need to lock down the ability to create SharePoint teams so that then you can decide that structure and make sure it's being stored in the way that you guys would like. Another side effect is a team, as an example, is built up of many different things. So when we create a team, it creates a SharePoint site in the background. So we could use that SharePoint site, but it also consumes a name. So from a governance perspective, if someone creates a finance SharePoint site and a finance team, you potentially have a conflict where one of those names has taken the site's finance name. So it's important we think about what's the governance, what's the structure, and how is that going to be rolled out so it doesn't impact everything else. It also creates a Microsoft 365 group, which again can take up an email address. So this distribution list here could take up finance at your organization. So if you're not careful, by creating a team called finance, you may then take an email address that you intended to use for another purpose. So it's important we're not kind of, when we just go ahead and create these teams and the users have the capability to create these teams, we need to know what's the impact of that and what's the knock-on effects it's going to have. Another common thing we see from a governance is people create planners so that they can manage and store their tasks. This also creates all of this other stuff alongside it. So you may create a planner thinking you're just having a simple plan, but the end result is you've got a team, a SharePoint site, and all these other bits that you weren't aware of. So I think from a governance perspective, it's very important that you guys think about what happens when we roll these applications out, when we deploy teams. If people have the ability to create teams, what's going to happen? If we have SharePoint rolled out, there is a hidden checkbox for SharePoint to stop users from creating SharePoint sites, which you'd have a similar situation with. Each of these applications also has different points of egress. So when you enable SharePoint and Teams, you want to make sure you're fully aware of what happens if a guest's added to Teams. What happens if external sharing is enabled? Do we want external sharing for every SharePoint site, or should it be limited that our intranet is internal only? So as part of when we run through these strategy pieces, it's very much about going to each of those applications, understanding what are the key settings, what are the points of egress, and what's the implication of what happens when we create that. And what we look to do is really define a good structure. So back onto here, when we work with organizations, we'd look at creating a really easy to follow governable structure. So we have our departmental sites, we have our project sites, we have our company-wide. We're going to use SharePoint for this purpose. If it's laid out in those very simple terms, it becomes very easy for you guys to roll this out across your organization. If you don't have this plan, you won't have a clear way of where you're going, and you'll suddenly then end up with team sprawl, no governance, and it'll become very difficult for you guys to manage. Next piece that we want to cover is around adoption. Now, we're only going to touch lightly on this because the next session we're doing is very much a deep dive into the adoption piece. But an important part of your Microsoft 365 strategy, once we've got the governance in place, is how are we going to get users to adopt this? So what do we need to think about to get those tool sets adopted, and what are the common kind of tips and tricks that people would do? So we work on creating a separate adoption strategy, which isn't just about training the users. Often training the users on some of the components of 365 still leaves them overwhelmed. As an example of that, we've had lots of organizations that have been trained on Microsoft Teams. So you could be trained on all the functionality of Teams, and there's a lot in there: meetings, chats, files, add-ons, apps. There's a whole host of components. And we find that training users just on those features is very, very ineffective. So if you were to just train people and say, here's all the features, off you go, they'll understand those features. But what they often lack is, how do I apply those features to my day-to-day job? Great, I know how to do meetings, I know what the files are. But what people are usually after is, we've done some analysis, we've done an adoption strategy, we've worked with your department, and what we've decided is this is the best way you can use Teams. So you should use the meetings to do daily catch-ups every morning and afternoon. You should put all your company files into there. You should use the chat to replace internal email. So what we're doing is we're taking all those features and functions, we're then applying them to the department that they're currently in, and we're giving them the blueprint to say, this is how you use those features. We've looked at your department and here's kind of a way forward. And then we train them on that way of working. And it's very clear then for them to say, well, I know exactly how I'm going to use this going forward because it's been set out in the way that I currently work, just translated into this modern tool set. So the adoption strategy really is diving into some of those components. The vision is, I think, very important. Defining what is the purpose of Office 365 as a whole. If someone was to ask you in a lift, what are we going to use Office 365 for? You should be able to convey that message very easily in a couple of sentences so people know what that's about. But that can also stem down into the applications. So if you're going to utilize Teams, we've had many organizations who are looking to utilize Teams to replace internal emails. They want to use it as their central communication platform, but they've often not conveyed that to the whole organization. So you're never going to get to the point of using Teams to replace everything and use your internal emails unless you convey that very clear vision to people as you do the training. Once you convey the message alongside that methodology I mentioned of adapting the training, if we make it clear to say Teams is going to replace internal emails, we're going to use it for this, this, and this, those visions and those objectives become very clear signposts for people to say, this is how we're using the platform. If it's just an expectation you've not conveyed, it's very unlikely that your vision is going to come to pass because nobody's aware of what it is. So really, we need to define those vision for the overall project and then for the individuals. We also need to look at a roadmap. There's a lot of tool sets in 365. You can't just flick a button one day and everybody's using Teams, SharePoint and everything. We need to kind of grow the technology alongside their capabilities. So we recommend looking at phased approaches. Intranets in SharePoint are a very good example of a phased approach because they're very easy to use. They're very much more of a person going in to look for information. So what we try and do is build a roadmap of the features and the functions that they're going to get and add them in over time, and then make sure that they're trained up and have the resources alongside them. A communication strategy is important. So if we're going to spend a lot of time creating a vision and working on creating training sessions and roadmaps, I've got a quick example of a communication strategy here, in which we're just defining when the training sessions would happen, when we're going to send key emails, when each of those key points are happening in the project. So it's just very much kind of outlining how are we going to keep people involved with this, how are we going to get people excited about it. Champions, we really need these, especially in larger organizations. Champions within each of the departments and the organization can basically help champion what this product's about. Once we've got the vision, it relies on a certain level of policing. If we have champions within those departments are aware that the way that department's going to work moving forward, they're almost responsible for policing it as well. If people fall back to using emails instead of using the Teams message, those champions can be the ones that keep people on path to make sure that they're using the new tool sets. Regular reviews, so your strategy, both your adoption strategy and your overall 365 strategy are going to change. They'll be different every quarter. So it's important we just do a regular review just to make sure it's on path. Is there new features? Is there new things that we need to think about? Or is there bits that aren't working as well as we planned? Resources alongside all of this. So it's not just about providing the training and the other pieces, but we can build SharePoint training portals, we could build Teams training portals, all that kind of thing will definitely help the adoption of this side of things. And finally, certifications. So Microsoft provide a lot of learning. If you are keen on doing this, you could get your champions on learning pathways from Microsoft so they can get more knowledge and keep up to date and really get certified for what they're working on, which can only help them moving forward. So that's kind of a snippet of an adoption strategy. We'll cover that off in much more detail in our next session, but hopefully gives you a glimpse of what we'd look to define as part of that Microsoft 365 strategy. The next piece which we touched on is the security. So this is a critical part of any Microsoft 365 project. If you don't get the security right, you're going to have problems down the line. And there's lots of applications and licensing that are available now. The most popular Microsoft 365 licensing that we always recommend is the Microsoft 365 Business Premium license. So just as a very quick overview, the Business Premium license includes all of the productivity tools, but it also includes the additional security tools. So things like Intune, conditional access, single sign-on, autopilot. And what we often work with on organizations for this is defining that baseline security. So to activate all of the services that we have, like Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, etc., we need to have the baseline of security set up in a good way. So conditional access is used to limit who can access the mobile phone, who can access the data from different devices. So this conditional access is a critical part of your security because it can block people accessing 365 from home PCs. It can enforce MFA. It can do all sorts of things that would really limit the damage that someone could do if they were trying to log into your 365 environment. The Secure Score is a great tool that can give you some indication of what you should look at for your baseline. Intune has some fantastic and easy to configure products like mobile application management, which allows you to protect work data on a mobile phone. So if you have someone signing into Teams on a personal phone, Intune would allow you to put a policy in place to allow you to encrypt that data and wipe it if you needed to. And advanced threat protection can be used in Exchange, SharePoint, Teams to make sure there's no malicious links or SharePoint or Teams. So we consider that having an initial Microsoft 365 security baseline enables you then to activate those services. You have to have these settings in place because you know the environment's secure no matter what services you activate moving forward. And then also from a security perspective, we look at doing a deep dive into each of the products. So SharePoint, what are the settings we need to go through from there? Teams, it's really reviewing each of those settings and making sure that as you're activating additional services, the security is enabled across the board. So one of our most popular services is a Microsoft 365 security hardened package. So we have two classes, the basic, which is basically designed for users who don't have business premium, and an advanced package, which is designed for users that have business premium. And this is about enabling that baseline functionality. So going through what we consider to be the key settings, such as conditional access, Intune app management, advanced threat protection, DLP, and making sure that those settings are configured to best practice from Microsoft. And it just streamlines the configuration and deployment of those. The next piece that we want to talk about is around the migration. And I know my colleague recently did a session on migration of files to 365. So if anybody wants to play that back, I'd jump into that session on our YouTube channel. It was a great presentation, but it's a very important consideration about what is the migration approach that you're going to take for this platform. There's lots of things you can migrate into 365. We could migrate emails into Exchange. We could migrate personal files into OneDrive, and we could migrate data into SharePoint, Microsoft Teams. As part of your strategy, you need to determine what is the migration approach. So how are we going to migrate those files? As an example for file migrations, it could be a lot for you guys to take on board of moving everyone's files from the current file server and then moving them all into Teams and expecting them to go live with that new way of working straight away. So in a migration approach we often work with is just looking at moving the files from where they currently reside and then moving them into a OneDrive syncing location like this. So we can have the files such as the finance files available. We can get the users up to speed with using this way of working, but hidden in the background is the full functionality of Microsoft Teams. So if we didn't want to overwhelm our users and just give them everything, a change to the way their files work, or change to the way their teams work, we would look at very much creating a Microsoft team that's hidden in the background. We wouldn't even present that to the users. We would migrate their files into this platform, and then we'd help them get used to this way of working. It's not hugely different from a file server, but we'd show them the real-time collaboration, the ability to take files offline and the sharing. And once they're happy and comfortable with this way of working, you're then able to say, right, guys, now you've got used to this, we can now give you Microsoft Teams, which has got all of your files within it, but now it's going to provide you a centralized place for files. It's going to provide you meetings and conversations. So I think from a file migration approach, that's a really good way of achieving that. But you need to think about all of the products that are available. If you've got an existing intranet, do you plan to move everything from your old intranet into SharePoint Online? We very rarely see people do that process of a lift and shift because quite often they want to take the opportunity to clean it. So for a SharePoint intranet, often building the shell in the new system and then helping those departments move the stuff over they want into the new structure is the best way of working. But I would recommend that you sit down through each of those key product sets, SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, and just think about what's the migration? How are we going to approach this moving forward? So the final piece really is just bringing it all together. So I've put together a very basic example of a roadmap, but once you've been through this process, it's very much about then defining that and putting some timelines on it. So I've got a roadmap example here. So an initial piece around doing a strategy planning workshop and an adoption strategy. These are the key phases really in going through what we've talked about: governance, security, migration, adoption training, and defining how that's going to work for each of the key applications. Once you've done that, we've then got our security baseline configuration. So this is making sure the core security of 365 is set up to best practice so that then no matter what we do, if we deploy Exchange or SharePoint or files, that baseline is going to cover our bases and we can then just improve upon the security as we go through that. We then commonly, if you haven't moved to Exchange yet, you'd look at doing an Exchange migration. You may then look at a SharePoint intranet deployment, file migration, and then throughout this process would be the training and the adoption that I mentioned before. And as I showed and demonstrated before, we'd look at building a change communication strategy alongside this to notify people about what the objectives are, give people education sessions. So like this senior leadership session here is an overview of Microsoft 365. So the senior leaders are aware of how this is going to work, what they need to do to champion it, that kind of thing. So the kind of some useful tips that we have on this. So we've got a YouTube channel where we've got all of our previous videos. So you can jump onto there, and a lot of the topics I've discussed, especially the overviews, you'll be able to find videos of 365 overviews, security overviews, or just get in touch with myself and I'm happy to do that. I'd also recommend you determine your security baseline. So if you aren't aware, the security YouTube's really good, but you can go on there and define what would our conditional access policies be? What are we happy with as we roll these platforms out? You definitely need to understand the 365 productivity and security tool sets. You won't be able to define a strategy if you aren't aware of all the products and what they do. If you were looking at migration, break it down into manageable chunks. So don't try and do a big bang approach for a file migration and expect everyone's going to have all their files moved over and start using Teams on day one. It's going to be much easier if you can break it into chunks, perhaps departments at a time, that you can train up, get them up to speed with Teams, learn from that experience, and then move on to the next department. I don't think it would be as an effective approach just to do a big bang approach. And then the final piece is just block down the common areas that cause governance problems, like Teams creation, SharePoint creation. Make sure there's no areas in which people can start to create lots of different Teams and SharePoints without you knowing. So we do offer a Valto workshops. So as I mentioned, we've got a Microsoft 365 strategy workshop, which covers what we've been going through today in much more detail. But we do a whole host of additional workshops. So if you're interested, get in touch, hello@valto.co.uk, or give me a shout. And we'll now jump over to some questions. So if anybody's had any questions throughout this process, you should be able to ask those now in the Q&A function on the Teams invitation. So just give everyone a minute to ask any questions they may have. No questions coming through as of yet. Okay, well, if you guys do have any questions that you didn't have a chance to ask me on there, just give me a shout and I'm more than happy to help you out. I'll jump on a call and go through that. As I mentioned before, if you're interested, we're doing another one of these on Microsoft Masterclass Series, which is about adopting Microsoft 365. We're doing that on the 26th of January. It'll be about half an hour to 45 minutes. And you can find that on Eventbrite, but I'm also going to send out a link to everybody after this as well. And I guess the final piece is just have a great Christmas, everybody. And thank you very much for joining today.